Welcome back. This time we're talking about Blair Witch, a sequel to 1999's found footage horror film The Blair Witch Project. Now this is actually the second sequel after 2000's Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows. Now that film is pretty much universally regarded as a flop financially and a failure creatively. Although I recently watched a really interesting video on the GoodBlackFlick's YouTube channel that delves into how the studio completely meddled with the process and ultimately eviscerated the director's vision for that movie. And one of the things I took note of in that video was the fact that the director of Book of Shadows, one of the main things he was attempting to do was not make the obvious sequel, which would be to send another group of teenagers or young 20-somethings out into the woods with video cameras and have the same thing happen again. And that thought was in the forefront of my mind when Blair Witch started, and it essentially begins the same way the Blair Witch Project did, with a little placard saying that a group of people went out in the woods and sometime later their video footage was found. Because Blair Witch is essentially that obvious sequel in which a group of teenagers / 20-somethings go out into the same woods that Heather and company did in the Blair Witch Project, and craziness ensues. Now, if you've seen my video review of the Blair Witch Project, that's a horror film that I actually enjoyed quite a bit. Even though I myself am not a huge horror fan. It's just not a genre that draws me in. But the Blair Witch Project was a movie that I saw when it originally hit theaters in 1999, and I was intrigued by this new sequel enough that I rewatched the Blair Witch Project and did a video on it, and surprisingly the movie held up pretty well. Having now seen Blair Witch, I have to say, rewatching the Blair Witch Project was probably the worst thing I could have done to enjoy this new movie. Because although this is technically a sequel, it's essentially a remake, because the same things pretty much happen. The story centers on James, who is the younger brother of Heather from the first film. Although about 15 years have passed since his sister went missing, he's still searching for answers to what actually happened to her. So when a new film is discovered in the same woods that she went missing, his interest is rekindled, and he gathers a group of friends to go on an expedition into those woods to try to find new answers. And among them is his friend Lisa, who is a aspiring filmmaker, and she's trying to make a documentary out of this expedition. And if this sounds a lot like the story behind the Blair Witch Project, it's because it is. It's essentially cribbing many of the same beats. The only real difference here is there's more people. We have 6 instead of 3. And since this film, at least story-wise, is attempting to follow the same path as the Blair Witch Project, it finds itself in essentially a catch-22. On one hand, anyone who's seen the original Blair Witch Project, when they attempt to do the same things in this movie, it's sort of old hat. It's not as creepy, it's not as intense as what we saw the first time. And on the other hand, when it attempts to do more than what we got in that first film, show more, be more intense with the supernatural elements, it loses the plausibility, the believability that the original Blair Witch Project had. And this is getting into a little bit of spoiler territory for that film. We never actually see anything in that movie that couldn't, at least on a broad level, couldn't be explained away. And for me, as someone who's not a huge fan of horror, that was the thing that really added the biggest level of dread and horror to that film, was there was a plausibility to it. So as soon as the new film, and I don't want to get into spoilers, but as soon as the new film essentially crosses the line to where we're seeing outright supernatural events, it kind of lost me. And that's not to say that a horror film with supernatural elements is not scary. One of the biggest detriments to this film is that it really doesn't feel like they have a focused story. There's a lot of various things that happen to our characters, and really there's no tying thread. It never really feels like there's this malevolent force directing these actions. It just seems completely random from scene to scene. And kind of building on that, there are a number of things that happen in this movie that really could have gone somewhere interesting, but ultimately go nowhere. And for the most part, all but one or two of the storylines pretty much just fizzle out. And there's sort of a twist at the end that I actually saw coming pretty far in advance. But even if I hadn't seen it coming, there's so much randomness to the evil that we're experiencing, or at least our characters are experiencing, that when we do get that reveal of the twist, it just feels like another random event, because there's nothing tying it together with anything else that's happened before. So for me, as someone who enjoyed the Blair Witch Project, I found this sequel pretty disappointing. I didn't find it necessarily scary, other than the overabundance of jump scares, most of them being fake outs. The story essentially goes nowhere. There's so many random things that never tie together. It ultimately just kind of became boring by the end. I was just waiting for it to end. You basically know how it's going to end. It's just a matter of how they get there, and frankly, I was bored before they got to the end. Now, I will say, this is a sequel where I think you would actually get more out of it if you've not seen the original, because at least then you're not dealing with the retreads. So you at least have that element of surprise. But ultimately, this is a not terribly scary, ultimately kind of boring horror film. So if you've seen Blair Witch, what did you think about it? What did you think of the original if you've seen it? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and until next time, I'll see you at the movies.